We're going to start just a little 5 minutes earlier than before. Are you still around? Or should we give you another 5 minutes? Set? Okay, great. I'll steal your attention, gently steal your attention. Yes, I'm a very gentle thief. All right, hi guys, welcome very much to the next research talk on games and loss. We have 3 very cool presentations. 2 are online. First, we are going to have Mikko Meriläinen give a talk about loss in relationship to masculinity and toxic gamer culture. Very excited. After that, we are going to have Diego coming in all the way from Spain to give a talk on post-Soviet presentations in games. And then finally, we're going to have Julian here in person giving a talk on his research on games and suicide, I believe. Awesome. To give you a little bit of a heads up, once again, the rules of this presentation format. Each presenter is going to have 10 minutes. I am going to give them gentle signals of when you are 5 minutes in, 10 minutes in, at which point they will keep talking. At some point they will finish around the 10-minute mark, and you will have 10 minutes to ask questions and talk back to the researchers. Cool? If researchers go a little bit over time, also not a huge problem. It'll just eat up the audience feedback time. Cool? All right. Any questions? Any feelings? Any thoughts? Anything we want to throw into the space? Silence. I love it. All right. With that, we're going to start with Mikko, who is going to give our first talk. So Mikko, if you want to share your screen at this point. This is our first time using this particular technological. Very good. All right, great.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, that's brilliant. So good evening, everyone. Greetings from very gray and rainy Helsinki. If I promised to talk about toxic gamer culture, because I haven't prepared a talk on that subject, but if I promised, then Leland, I'm really sorry. Anyway, as the title suggests, I'll be talking a little bit about not playing games. So I got to thinking about this topic of loss, and as I'm not really a scholar of games as such, as games as artifacts, so I wanted to say a few words about game players instead. So first, a few words about myself. So I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here or there at Tampere University, and my main focus is on gaming as a part of everyday life. And I'm currently working with men and masculinities in gaming, as well as questions of youth gaming and miniaturing. I have personally been gaming since age 5, and this isn't this isn't intended as a flex. It's very much more of a context to this presentation. So what I'm really going to talk about in this short talk is on reasons why people do not play games and what kind of implications that might have. So if we're looking at gaming as an everyday phenomenon, in game research, we often talk of the magic circle. We discuss how separate gaming in its different forms is from the rest of our everyday life, but we can kind of never escape the idea that gaming always happens in the context of everyday life. You cannot escape yourself. You cannot escape your body. You cannot escape your surroundings, no matter how fantastic the game you are playing might be or what the fiction of the game might be. So this is always something that kind of ties us in to this moment and to ourselves. So for better or worse, we cannot really escape ourselves. Maybe it follows from this that gaming is very often taken for granted, especially like when we are speaking from this very kind of typically from a quite affluent middle class position, for example. So gaming is just kind of something we do. We can access it whenever. It's usually seen as being up to our own preferences, whether we wish to play or not, and that is kind of often the main regulator. And of course, this is a very sort of wealthy Finnish perspective, and some problems with that, which we'll get to in a moment. As an activity, gaming can be viewed as both very robust. So gaming is quite flexible. We can play different games. We can play in different situations. There's a huge variety of things we can do with gaming, and even in situations where a lot happens around us. If the world changes, we can often still find ways of gaming, and because gaming is often also quite a private activity, then we can sort our lives in a way that allows us to keep on playing games. At the same time, gaming is quite frail for often those same reasons. It is tied to our material reality, for example. It consumes quite a lot of mental resources. It often requires social contacts. It requires money, for example. So this kind of puts it in a weird position where it's at the same time quite resilient to changes around us, but also can be quite easily disrupted. And for examples of when this kind of thing might happen, so the first one is a very dramatic one. So a few points, a few quotes from my research on gaming during the COVID-19 lockdown. Well, we didn't have an actual lockdown here in Finland, but what passes for a lockdown. So the first one is from a person who just had a small baby. So there just doesn't seem to be time for gaming, having a 4-month-old baby. Maybe if my husband was also at home, but as a nurse, he will be working until he falls ill. I would like to play more, but there is not enough time. So of course, COVID-19 was a very dramatic, exceptional situation. So the world kind of really changed in terms of the mental work we had to do, in terms of emotional labor, and also in terms of physical labor. And for example, domestic chores and things like this. So when this kind of thing happens, the family dynamic changes, and all of a sudden a person finds themselves without the time or the energy to play games. There's a second quote from a different person. There has been less role-playing gaming, and this is about tabletop role-playing mostly. My child hasn't been able to play Dungeons and Dragons at all. LARPs for both the child and me have obviously all been cancelled. I've tried doing some tabletop role-playing game over a remote connection, but it's not the same. So here again, the exceptional situation sort of flips it around. Even if there was an opportunity to play, as in the case of remote tabletop gaming, it doesn't feel the same. It's not the kind of similar experience. It maybe doesn't have the same emotional fulfillment that a traditional face-to-face tabletop gaming session would have. And of course, LARPs, live-action role-playing games, which rely on being face-to-face in the same physical space. Of course, COVID for that period took away all of that. But there's also a much less dramatic side to this. So this everyday restrictions to playing games. Well, I wasn't even allowed to play Minecraft until I was 12 years old because my parents thought it was too violent, as you can kill cows and pigs in it. Nowadays, when I no longer live with my parents, there are of course no restrictions. If we have people in the room who play digital games or have played digital games as children, I assume that this is somewhat familiar topic to you. Maybe you have similar experiences. So a very kind of common thing stopping children and young people from playing is simply their parents saying that you're not allowed to play games. And it's something that we often kind of forget when we are talking about things like screen time. Then we are actually regulating access to a very big kind of form of culture, a big part of young people's everyday life, and all that goes with it, like the social life, the cultural capital, and everything. And it gets reduced into this sort of discussion of how many hours of screen time is enough. There's another quote. I don't have enough money for games, and I'm constantly wondering if I can buy an interesting game or if I have to limit my food purchases. The games are constantly getting more expensive, even though it seems that, for example, the people who actually made the game in the game development team do not get enough compensation for the profits of all the games for the investors, and those who have not made the games themselves. This seems unfair. I also don't think I have time to play enough because of my studies and running my everyday life. This might also be familiar to you. here we can see a whole bunch of everyday obstacles to playing games, whether it's lack of money, whether it's lack of time, whether it's just the sort of effort that goes into running our everyday lives. Again, something that is quite often overlooked is gaming takes up quite a lot of energy. While we often frame it as being this kind of fun, leisurely thing, which it of course also is, taking time to play games, it is time. It is time that you have to allocate for the game. Learning how to play a new game is quite consuming. If you are tired or if you're stressed out, you might not actually want to take your time to do that. For me personally, even though I work from home and I'm quite lazy, still picking up a new game when I know that I have to put in maybe 60 to 80 hours to finish the game, it can feel exhausting. And I don't have small children, for example. So in these ways, many of these very undramatic everyday things get in the way of gaming, and again they block us away from this activity, which is of course in general quite wonderful. And of course there are plenty of other reasons as well. There's hostile gaming culture, so this is my nod towards the toxic masculine gamer culture. For example, people in our studies, for example, have said that they avoid specific games, or they avoid specific genres of games or competitive gaming modes because they are expecting a very hostile reception if they go there. Or if they are, for example, women, if they are non-binary players, they assume, and maybe also based on experience, that if they use their microphone in game, then they will get attacked. So again, this blocks away a part of gaming culture for them. There are accessibility issues, of course, like if there isn't a controller that you can use, it doesn't even have to be like a very severe disability. Some people, for example, get a repetitive strain injury from using a console controller, and all of a sudden your hands cannot cope with you gaming. Let alone if we need more specialized controllers, such as controllers for blind people, or you need to operate the game using your mouth, for example. Again, very, very difficult if you don't have specialized equipment for it. Some people stop playing because they experience this feeling of loss of control. They feel that their gaming is going in a problematic direction, and they have to kind of quit it full stop because they no longer feel that they are in control of their own gaming, and this causes them distress. And then it can also be a case of wanting to play multiplayer games or role-playing games or something like this, and simply not having the people to play these games with. And again, you're left in a situation where you are not able to play the games that you wish. The very important question, why should we care? And we're nearing the end. I wanted to leave the important stuff for the end. So first of all, there are the practical considerations. So understanding that people have very unequal access to games and the intersections of gaming and other areas of life are quite important and interesting to discuss. From an academic point of view, as researchers, we have tended to be much more interested in why people play games than why they don't play games. So it is always been kind of assumed in a lot of the cases that people who don't play games are simply not interested in games, which of course is simply not true. A lot of people are interested in games but do not play them for a variety of reasons, as just mentioned. Then there are the personal considerations, and I assume that there are people for whom gaming is personally relevant, personally important in the room. So you can always spend a few moments considering, like, who would you be without gaming? How would your life have turned out if you never had access to gaming, if you didn't have people to play games with, maybe if you didn't have the opportunities for whatever reason to play games? If you were to quit playing games right now for whatever reason, what would you lose? What would you gain? Would you have more time, more money? Would you be less excited about your life, about the world? Would you be more stressed, and so on? And then we have the big existential questions. What do we lose as human beings? What do we lose as societies if we lose the ability or we lose the resources to play games? And what kind of situations, what kind of ideologies, what kind of thinking can bring about these kinds of situations? How can we avoid them? How can we make it possible for people to play games if they want to? This was a very compact, a little under 13 minutes. Some further reading. So first off, if you're interested, the couple of papers that I picked the quotes from that I used in this presentation. So some work on adults gaming during COVID-19 in Finland, and then some thoughts on young people's gaming. And then there's work by Geli Bergström on quitting EVE Online, from Martin Gibbs and Melissa Rogerson, is board game play and parenting and trying to negotiate the two. And then a few papers from our very own Elisa Viik and Kati Alha. So how players negotiate their gameplay in different situations and in different life conditions. That's all for me. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, then please go ahead.
Okie dokie. Yes, big round of applause. Thank you so much, Mikko. Sorry for vastly misrepresenting you, but that was excellent. I loved that a lot. All right, we have a first question.
Okay. Thank you, Mikko, for the talk. It was really interesting and good to hear that I was not alone struggling with many of these issues, for example, during COVID-19. One thing I'm curious about, because that was one of the reasons not to play games for me and some people I know, was shaming for not playing games because of the other life experiences. For example, during COVID-19, when I was still working as a department assistant, I was constantly shamed by people who had in-person work and were locked at home and weren't able to go out. They were sitting playing and saying something like, "Why don't you play video games? Why you are working?" Even though you have some online work. Have you encountered some work studies in your work this as a particular reason not to play, or a particular issue with not playing, this different types of shaming like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. So I don't recall seeing in my study kind of this like direct shaming over not playing games, but some things that all kind of touch upon it. So one of them was that there were people who felt like that they should be playing games, but for example didn't have the energy. There was this kind of frustration that now I would finally have the time to play, but I cannot, like usually for lack of energy, for example, or because they were doing online work and they didn't want to spend their evenings as well as their days sitting by the same computer. Kind of on the other side, for some people, the COVID situation kind of gave them the permission to play games. So they had this feeling where like now they don't feel like they're wasting time by playing games. Like if you cannot if you have to stay at home anyway, and you can't go to the gym or whatever, then you can finally play games at home with a clear conscience. But I can definitely see this kind of shaming going on as well, and it is quite a plausible thing, because I think there was also like a very kind of big public push, like now we should all be gaming, this sort of thing. And even like the World Health Organization was partnering up with the game industry and saying, please stay at home and play games. But I think it's also a very good demonstration of how differently people also react to these kind of changing situations, and how it allows some people much more time to enjoy games or much more energy, and then strips others of those. So very common was, for example, in families, like one of the parents would have much more time to play games, and the other parent would have much more domestic chores, for example.
Cool. Other questions? Right. I have a question. So it seemed to me that part of what you were seeing was that people lost gaming based on things that would be considered outside of the magic circle, as you brought up. How do you feel like the idea of a magic circle for people who kind of believed in this boundary between games and non-games masked or changed this experience for them in their lives?
That's a really good point, and it's a really good question. I like first of all, I like the idea of a magic circle, and I think I could still, or it could still be seen in these experiences, like even though kind of it could be broken by these things coming in from outside the magic circle, kind of like no matter how kind of exciting your game was or something, but if you were just, for example, too exhausted to enjoy it, then there is no escape available. At the same time, for a lot of people, it also appeared that they really kind of the difficult situation sort of reinforced the thought of the magic circle for them, or the idea, because many explicitly spoke of gaming offering this sort of like a protective frame and protective bubble. And this is again like what I mentioned, like at the very start, is of gaming being quite a robust and resilient hobby. So when everything in the world was changing, then gaming was the one thing that stayed constant, and you could kind of play a game, you could tune out all the horrible news from around the world, you could tune out the stress and all the kind of anxiety. And it's probably it's no coincidence that, for example, Animal Crossing was very popular during COVID, and it has this very kind of cheery, upbeat, cutesy sort of thing. And at this stage, I've already forgotten what you asked, but I hope that this answered it in a sense.
Yep, nailed it. Yes, other questions? Did you notice any trends or anything about who was losing gaming, or like different ways that people were?
Oh yeah, for sure. A lot of the families with small children, they were the big losers, like in this sense. Yeah, not the best
Mikko
choice of
Meriläinen
words.
in 2024.
Yeah,
Yes.
but for example, also for people who could work from home, this could be kind of a double-edged sword, because people who were working from home, many of them kind of spoke about this kind of tech fatigue. So you're on the computer working at home for 8 hours, so you really don't have energy to play for a couple more hours at the same computer. And this was my personal experience, for example. But of course, then you had families with small children, and there simply wasn't peace and quiet to play games. Or if they had children, not even that young, but teenagers, for example, then the teenagers would they would hog the TV, or they would hog the game console all day long, and then parents kind of had to put their own gaming on the back burner, so their children, because they viewed that it was more important for their children than for themselves. Then some really surprising ones. So people who would usually play during their work commute would stop playing games, because you were no longer commuting to work, and and the game you played was on your phone, and it was kind of a commuting routine, so that stopped. So lots of these really kind of interesting. So it made a lot of invisible things about gaming very visible. All of a sudden, this sort of really flipped situation made people completely reconsider like their views on gaming and their practices. Another thing that many parents, for example, noticed, that now that they were home with their children the whole day, they realized, for example, like how much their children were playing. Or they would relax their children's gaming rules to allow them to play more and stay in touch with their friends and so on. So plenty of really interesting stuff happened during COVID, and of course not the majority of it was good, but from a research into gaming point of view, some really interesting changes.
Okay, great. Let's give another big round of applause for Mikko.
Thank you.
Great, Mikko, if you would unshare your screen, and then Diego, It is. Ball is in your.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you good.
Okay. So let's share my screen. Okay. Okay, so can you see this?
Yep, it looks great.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so hello again. Well, my name is Diego Mejia. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Sevilla. Well, in my case, I loved Mikko's talk, but I do treat games as cultural political objects. So, well, as you can see, I work with with post-communist nostalgia. And today I want to talk to you about a specific kind of loss that current trends of nostalgia in video games are bringing back, not only aesthetically, but also politically, although not in the way you may think, since nowadays the politics of nostalgia are less about the things we lost in the past and more about the ones that were lost in the future. As we are all aware, the world as we know it has been coming to an end for quite a while, at least on screen. With the rising popularity in recent years of apocalyptic TV series and films on the one hand, and of post-apocalyptic games and literature on the other, audiovisual and interactive narratives and their mutual adaptations have not only rendered the devastation of Western societies a common sight and recurrent cultural representation, but have also established a new fascination with aesthetics of destruction, capitalist cyber utopias, and digital dystopias. This fascination, particularly in video games, has extended its side to the East and has now found a renewed interest in depicting barren post-communist landscapes as means to comment critically on their national memories by reflecting on past environmental and socio-political issues. Most of these games, however, also engage with the adoption of capitalist ideology, especially manifested in the way their representations of the past approach their social organizations and in-game economies, as well as in the way they represent communist stereotypes mostly inherited from popular culture. Nevertheless, the games I will show you today have opted for a more critical view of the future, revealing the certainty of an environmental collapse and therefore the end of human civilization. Even though they sometimes present a playful facade dressed in the retro-futuristic aesthetics of the Cold War era, these games engage also with mourning and various kinds of personal, collective, and cultural losses that subvert the socialist styles, aesthetics, and discourses found in their representations, while examining the cosmic promises and fantasies of the Soviet space program and the utopian socialist project. Understanding these games as postmodern cultural objects, I approach their discourses of loss following a notion of ontology close to the ones proposed by Simon Reynolds and Mark Fisher, who reworked Derrida's concept, applying it to the sonic signatures of popular music. Since loss in these games, as Fisher argues happens with ontology, it's a question of hearing what is not there, the sound coming to occupy the displays of writing. In Lifeless Planet, an aimless astronaut and sole survivor of an international human mission reaches a distant planet scientists thought to be a thriving Earth-like paradise, only to find instead a barren wasteland product of a secret Soviet colonization carried out during the 70s, thanks to the discovery of alien technology in Russian soil. With this context, the game fictional planetary colonization reflects on real-life Soviet environmental policies, while the events described talk more about current capitalist policies of human and environmental exploitation. Thus, regardless of the game's nostalgic sci-fi setting, its subtext is one of loss and despair. The astronaut protagonist, for instance, is not just a selfless hero trying to find a new home for humanity, but a husband that practically embarks on a suicide mission because his wife is in coma and he cannot help her, nor keep mourning her. Unable to find solace in this hostile planet, his mission to save humanity is displaced and works as a vehicle to talk about nostalgia, loss, past ideologies, transhumanism, and lost futures. Furthermore, as Simon Reynolds claims happens with hauntology in the UK, this sense of loss is culturally specific and heavily associated with materials being used and the specific meanings and memories they carry. The same is true for post-communist nostalgic games. This is why the aesthetics of these representations are consciously playing with a set of bygone cultural artifacts and forms that lie both in and outside the post-communist reality Western societies were exposed to. Through mainstream media and Soviet sci-fi literature, the stuff that was either pre-Soviet Russia or that remained outside of Cold War's common knowledge, now strategically mixed with Western popular culture. These aesthetics playfully reference, recreate, or parody both Eastern and Western cultures. In this sense, the politics of nostalgia of these games embrace a mode of longing that seeks to render the potential post-apocalyptic future intelligible and interpretable through the technology and aesthetics of the communist past, while simultaneously interrogating current pressing issues and adding its postmodern aesthetics. Thus, these games have the ability to expose haunting images of the past by reenacting these images in their versions of the future, restaging and expanding these images into interactive spaces that share both a multi and a transhistorical condition, where both past and future are omnipresent. For instance, in Golf Club Nostalgia, the protagonist Charlie comes back to Earth for the first time after he has successfully evacuated the ultra-rich to Tesla City on Mars, leaving the rest of humanity to their fate. According to the game's narrative, he's a nostalgic Earthling that cannot find his place in the new technocratic Martian society. Meanwhile, he's mourning the loss of his wife, whom he was unable to save from the apocalypse. The game's environmental narrative, however, haunts Charlie and the player with a different kind of loss. One in tune with Simon Reynolds when he argues that hauntology is all about memory's power to linger and prey on your mind, and memory's fragility destined to become distorted, to fade, and then finally disappear. This abstract structure in the background is a real-life Yugoslavian World War II memorial. Although the game's narrative mentions the fact that this is a monument and that the place we navigate is somehow related to a communist past, there is no reference whatsoever of its place of origin. This way, in Reynolds' terms, the developer's experience of Yugoslavian politics lingers in the game's environmental narrative, preys on Charlie's mind, but also gets distorted by the politics and aesthetics of apocalypse, to finally disappear as a disconnected, almost incidental part of the background. The present, says Jan Asman, is haunted by the past, and the past is modeled, invented, reinvented, and reconstructed by the present. However, it is not the past that these games miss or have lost, but the ability they had in the past to project a future that is no longer possible. Let us not forget that the socialist project envisioned a harmonious future in which the people's hard work would produce an utopian state of material satisfaction once capitalism withered away. At the same time, people had a wide access to two kinds of utopia, one that informed communist origin through Soviet literature, and another that projected its future through technological progress. In her seminal book, The Future of Nostalgia, Svetlana Boym documents the latter, noting how, soon after the first man flew into space, Nikita Khrushchev promised the children of her generation that they will live in an era of space flights, cosmic communism, and travel to the moon. We dreamed of going into space before going abroad, remembers Boym. of traveling upward, not westward. Lastly, while the historical that permeates these games is certainly a scene of losses, these are narrated as potential and not absolute. Therefore, they may be conceivably reactivated, reconfigured, and transformed by the present or in the future, thus offering some hope. Nevertheless, the irony of the paradox of the losses represented in these post-communist futures is that we lost the future itself. Because regardless of technological advances or the fact that we can navigate the stars and travel to distant planets, in these video games, we can also be certain that at some point, the world will end and that any prospect of utopia will descend into chaos and violence, benefiting the game's need to offer the players a quest. Thank you.
All right, perfect timing, exactly 10 minutes. Any questions, comments?
Hello, Diego. Do you see any patterns or any trends depending on who makes these games? Like, for example, what their countries of origin are, their structure as a company or creator, something like this?
Yes, definitely. If you basically you can think about two main trends. The first one is just Western developers, well, primarily Western, that develop games that are basically our everyday life Cold War video game. If you think in all these movies that were produced during the 80s that depicted the Cold War, or in the 90s, you have the spies, you have all these connections with all the mythology of the Cold War. So basically, that's what Western studios were doing till pretty recently. But now, since the past maybe 10 years, or and in some cases a bit more, if you think on games like Metro or Stalker, that's 2006, I think. More recently, are Eastern developers that are developing these games. So the new trend, if you want to call it a new trend, is that they are depicting their own story. They are telling their story. This story is not told from the eyes of the Cold War, American Cold War, and not through the eyes of only popular culture, because popular culture is really important for these games.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot for the talk. I'm having a question which maybe relates a little bit. Because you showed two quite different types of examples. On one side, this with Metro and Stalker examples, which feel a little bit more like rooted in this idea of socialist realism versus this extreme over-the-top retro futurism of I would say probably primarily US American and Central European imaginations of this kind of like post-communist dystopia or future, or however it's framed. Do you have any further insight on the specific, let's say, choice behind those very specific aesthetic appearances, specifically for the retro futurist depiction of like post-communist society or post-Soviet society, maybe more?
Yeah, well, that will definitely depend on the country of origin that you were talking. It's not only the representation, but also the country. For instance, in the last one of the games that I presented, it's This was a game based on a novel of Stanislav Lem, and the studio is actually Polish. So you have a mix between, if you're talking about aesthetics, of real Soviet aesthetics of the time, but these were spread along the whole Eastern Bloc. So there are a lot of things that are shared, but at the same time, this studio mixes comic styles from both the Eastern Bloc, but also the United States. So you will get one part that is definitely local. There are aesthetics that are pretty recognizable if you know these countries, but at the same time, these are attractive for an international audience. So they keep this base as local, but they use international Western pop culture references to be appealing for the rest of the audience. So if you're talking specifically about an aesthetic approach, it will definitely have something to do also with what's the kind of relationship they have to nostalgia in their context, because every country has a different concept of nostalgia from the communist past. Please,
Thank
Mikko.
you.
Yeah, thank you. This was kind of related to what you were just saying. I was kind of interested in if you know like what the reception to these kinds of games have been, because obviously like the Soviet Union's legacy, for example, isn't the isn't the best. So kind of maybe I have this sort of vague question on how have these games been received in general, and maybe this question of is it possible to detach the aesthetic from the kind of from the political history of the Soviet Union, for example, and kind of could you kind of open up that problematic a little bit?
Yes, of course. For instance, one of the games that I was showing, Golf Club Nostalgia, and in most of these games, maybe 70%, they may not look like it, but they are political games. They actually talk about the past, they talk about history, and in some cases, they can go really into dark places. So they are reflecting on the past. In some cases, it's not that they are detached because of the use of the aesthetics, but it's I think that most countries didn't have, there was not a rejection of the past. There were no trials. There was not this process of cleaning the memory of the country. So most of the aesthetics and the markets for these aesthetics remained within the popular culture. So this is just part of everyday life. It's just that it's withered because these politics are not current. But yeah, no, definitely. I wouldn't say just if you think in let's say Call of Duty, Cold War, that's completely disconnected of everything. It's a classic Cold War movie basically. But in these other cases, no, they're pretty aware. And in some cases, it's not only they go dark places, but they actually laugh about their own story. So I think they can be really healthy in some regards.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So a question. I noticed a lot of your examples for like post-Soviet nostalgia also kind of were in this visual imagery. And of course, a lot of that is because you're giving a visual presentation, and so those are going to be very clear examples. But I was wondering, do you have examples with these games where like the goals and mechanics that players are following also express a kind of Soviet nostalgia or a Soviet logic of goals and mechanics of achieving goals?
Yeah, that's the beauty and the problem with nostalgia, or the danger of nostalgia, is that this is not a nostalgia in the way that you would actually miss this time as an ideological machine, But as I was trying to demonstrate here, it's this idea that these societies, most of them, were they didn't live in the present. I mean, if you're talking of the time of the Cold War, they were living in the future. Especially if you think about all these dreams of living into space and all that stuff, it's like, of course, we had that in the West too, but think of an ideological apparatus that is telling you that this is not utopia. We will live we will have colonies in space, and we will have all this technology, and all will be happy because the socialist project will be real. And suddenly the Cold War ends. There's no more Eastern Bloc, and all of this disappears. So there's no future. And these games explore that. But now I'm not completely sure if I answered your question.
No, I mean, I think that's a very clear component analysis of that. That's really great. Okay, let's give a big round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we will now have Julian take a step up, get you set up with your presentation. You will clip this onto yourself. Yep.
Full screen thing is
right there.
go.
All right, so hello everyone. I'm the final talk here. I'm be talking to you particularly about grief in video games. So I'm Julian Gutierrez Carrera. I'm a doctoral researcher here at Tampere University. I know Leland introduced me through suicide, but that was perhaps a bit too morbid of a topic to talk about right now. So I will be talking to you particularly about grief in video games and how video games help us understand grief. But before we get into that, we need to talk about death. So I study video games from a humanities perspective, and this makes death a bit of a problem. While medically and objectively we know a lot about death, we know how we die, we know what makes us die, we know a lot about what happens to us when we die. Subjectively, we don't actually know that much about it, because death is that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. Nobody who has ever died has come back to tell us what it's like to be dead. Even now, have a quick thought experiment. Imagine what it must be like to be dead. And hold on to that image, because I will come back to this. Now, one might be inclined to say that because video games have this reliance on player characters and avatars, and we usually project ourselves onto them, so that when we're playing a cool game like Tony Hawk Pro Skater and we make our character do something really cool, we wouldn't say, oh, my character did something really cool. We say, oh, I did something really cool. One might be inclined to argue that experiencing death in a video game might help us experience it in real life, but this is not the case, right? Whenever we die in a video game, we respawn and we try again. But there is something that video games can help us understand, and that is grief. Because we cannot understand death through our own death, we must understand it through the deaths of others, particularly those close to us. And this is something that video games, particularly narrative video games, are actually very well equipped to deal with. Because while player characters have this affordance of near immortality, where death usually means a respawn, except in those games that are permadeath or that you may only play once, which are admittedly the minority of video games, the death of a non-player character is usually final, unless you engage with some form of metagaming as reloading a save. Normally, if a non-player character dies and you keep on playing, that's it, they're dead. So I want to talk to you about 3 games in particular. So our first one will be Signalis, which is a German indie game, very much a survival horror game, very much inspired by retro-futuristic sci-fi and the works of H.P. Lovecraft. So the game focuses on the story of Elster, who is this android woman you see on the screen right now. She and her co-pilot were on a space trip to find a new colony. but due to a failure, their spaceship crashes on an abandoned planet. And when she wakes up in the wrecks of the spaceship, her co-pilot is gone, and you must find her. Now, this is as I said, this is a survival horror game. This is quite a hard game. It's quite a rather horrifying game to play. The enemies you see here are androids, much like Elster is, who have been corrupted by some weird paranormal energy that is taking what should have been an abandoned mining facility and turned it into a populated mining facility with warping architecture, where the memories of the past of both Elster and the co-pilot she is looking for intermingle with one another in ways that shouldn't be possible. Now, as you play through this game, you're kind of wondering, is the person I'm looking for still alive? And while I do want you to go home and play this game, so I'm not going to spoil much, I will have to say something, that this game changes depending on how you play it. You get different endings depending on how much you die, how long it takes you to play this, how much you hesitate to use your weapons. But it doesn't matter what ending you get, you still have to deal with some form of grief. There is still loss baked into the whole process of getting through this. And I think the gameplay of it as being a survival horror game is actually rather powerful. Its usage of difficulty and horror as something that you must face in order to get to grief points to a certain cathartic value in grief. That there is that even though it feels awful to grieve, that there is something positive about it, something can redeem it in a way. Now, it's a good transition to my second game, Omori. This is also a horror game, but a psychological horror game. Mechanically, it's more like a role-playing game in which you play as this dual character, Sonny. He is a teenage boy who, having suffered the loss of his sister, must then also suffer the disintegration of his friend group. And as his friend group drifts further and further apart, he shuts himself in and starts becoming more and more obsessed with what goes on in his mind. So in this game, you play as the titular Omori, who lives in a rather delusional and childlike fantasy world where all his friends are still children and he still gets to hang out with all of them. This is, of course, a trauma response, and this is very much how Omori has been understood and talked about in academic works as a form of trauma through interiority and shutting oneself in. If Signalis was a game that ended in grief as catharsis, this is a game that starts with grief as a maladaptive behavior of what happens when we grieve too much, what happens when grief becomes trauma. And from the very beginning of this game, we have a sort of hidden branching paths of, do we let Sonny keep on being a shut-in, not answering the door to any of his friends, not trying to reconnect, and being haunted by metaphorical and literal shadows of his trauma? Or should we go outside, try to reconnect, try to get back to the world after loss? And this is, I think, the central part of where grief comes into play here. Of grief, despite having the potential to be something cathartic, it also has the potential to be something deeply negative, something traumatizing, something that can drain us and take us away from the world. Now, let's finish this with a bit of a more positive spin on grief. So unlike the previous two, this is not a horror game. This is more so a management simulation game. It is very heavily inspired by games like Stardew Valley or Harvest Moon. So in this game, you play as Stella, who is a recently deceased nurse who, for some reason, gets cast in the role of a new Charon, somebody who has to take departed souls and ferry them across the river Styx onto the way to the afterlife. But because this game really wants to say something about that, it wants to say something about how we grieve and how we should grieve, it takes that idea of taking the death to the afterlife and puts a positive spin on it. So the dead get to live on your ship, and you have to take care of them. You have to feed them, you have to talk to them, you have to make sure they are comfortable, you have to give them lots of hugs, and you have to help them tie all their loose ends. You have to help them experience the things they never experienced. You have to help them figure out the things they never figured out as you prepare them for their final trip to the afterlife. And this game, I think, is rather helpful in preparing us for grief. From the very beginning of the game, you know that the characters you will be interacting with are already dead. Their time has already passed, and you will eventually have to say goodbye to them. Even as you see them there, even as they must live on your ship, they must eventually stop living there, and their stuff must remain there. So this might prepare a player for grief. This might prepare us for how to deal with grief, how to deal with those who are soon to part or who have already parted, how we understand their parting and how we understand their absence. Now, I ask you to imagine yourselves, to imagine what death must be like. I imagine a number of you imagined what your lives what the people around you might continue on doing without you, because this is something that I imagined when I started thinking about what death might feel like. And put in light of these three games, I think, and particularly in the light of Spiritfarer, should we wait until this ending moment to start preparing for grief? Should we start treating others in a way that would prepare them to not feel lost in death? Should we start preparing ourselves to deal with other people's grief? These are the sort of questions I would like you to take home with you after these three games. Now, I was a bit heavy-handed with using Buckland's The Island of the Dead 3 times at the beginning. So I will also be rather heavy-handed here and end on the positive note by showing you his Island of Life. Thank you.
Another perfect 10 minutes. Very nice. Guess we will pass. Exactly. Great. Okay.
Thanks, Julian. I'm curious about what perspectives of grief do you care about? Because there's the grief experienced by the characters in game, or the sort of perspectives that the game affords, but there's also maybe yours as a player who might be doing an autoethnography, or there's what other people might experience with the game. So which ones of these are you interested in?
Well, I am broadly interested.
Sorry.
Yes, yes. Well, as I started in the beginning, I'm broadly focusing on representations of suicide in digital games. So I am very much interested in a variety of it. My work will mostly lead me to in-game representations, and thus those grief felt by characters in the game and how it's represented through characters. I do not really have the methodological basis for those autoethnographical ones, but they are still rather interesting in thinking of how a game might prime a player to feel like this.
Yeah. No, I'll be kind. One thing that I was wondering about when you talk about these games and also the other games that you're researching is, and this is not an easy question though, what sets the games apart from other works of art that also deal with grief? And the paintings there might have inspired me. Or can such an argument even be made? Should we set them apart?
Yes, you have some thinking time.
Yes, that is a very hard question. You're very kind going for the throat. Yes, that is the question I'm aiming to answer for the next 4 years. I think there is something that sets video games apart from these, from not just other narrative media, but also the paintings, as you say. I think the demand for some action from the player really sets these apart, especially with take something like Signalis or Spiritfarer, Omori. These games broadly give you different choices to make and different responses to grief from the characters to how they deal with death. So while this might not be necessarily the thing that sets them apart, because there are a number of interactive forms of narrative that are not video games. I think this is by and large what is rather unique about these on narrative level.
We also unshare the presentation in case Mikko or Diego have their hands up as well. Two hands, you can pass it.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I might start with the fact that I might have some games for you to play, connected not only with grief, but also with suicide heavily, all of them. And it's my turn for rather a comment than a question today. Listening to all that, and particularly seeing Spirit Fair, which I was both like happy about and very like surprised with, I started thinking about like you were talking about grief as something related to others. And suicide is something that usually is one way or another thought about as a loss of somebody. Like often in society, that's what people who had suicidal attempts hear, that we don't want to lose you. But also grief can be something very internalized as dealing with the loss of the self and dealing with the loss of one's past, one internal, one's feeling, etc., etc. Losing and killing of one's previous self and so on. And this is something that you might or might not be interested in looking at. But if you are, I have a good example of I would say an artist. And I know that at least one person will at this point know what I'm talking about. But an artist who created up to this time 3 one-game series and 2 games. All of them are pretty short, and all of them deal with suicide, with killing the previous selves, with death, grief, and many, many other related things. So if you are ever interested, you know where to find me.
And that actually fits perfectly because I'm somewhere in between those two questions and comments. Because also quite interested in obviously seeing some art historical works contextualized with digital games. But as you mentioned, narrative media, so texts, films, whatever else there is, as well as then more like visual arts. I was wondering a little bit where in this framework you would consider performative practices, because a lot of what you described for digital games is, even though there is a depiction of grief, there is also a specific interaction with grief from the player's side, something that we see a lot in, I would say, both religious, artistic performance, but also, of course, general cultural, social performances. Would be, if you have something on that, would be interested in hearing a little bit more about that, maybe. Very open question. I'm very sorry for that.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail on the head here, that I'm still processing through these things, but I don't quite think I have an answer for you for that. But let's talk about it. My first instinct right now is to say that it is related. There is some relationship between the action demanded of the player here and how the player engages with grief here, and how the player much engaged, and how a participant might engage with grief in religious performances or cultural practices. I do think they're related, but I can't quite tell you how right now. Thank you.
All right, good. Time for my question. So if after looking at these games, and I assume some other games, if you were to take away your personal viewpoint of what these games claim are the the goals and mechanics of grieving, how would you interpret the goals and mechanics of grieving as presented through these interactive art objects?
I would honestly interpret it as cathartic. So it is very much presented as something that feels rather bad. Bereavement creates a very negative feeling. That feeling of losing someone permanently is not necessarily positive, but it's a cathartic process. It's the way through which we process that bereavement has actually happened. I pointed to Signalis. Signalis is a game about getting to the end to finally be able to confirm a loss and grieve, right? So there is this sense that even though it's something that's terrible to experience, it's something that you must do in order to move on.
These games that focus on grief, is this a topic that you were, what brought you to this topic? How did you start thinking about these games?
Well, as I told you, my research on suicide has broadly led me to interact with games that are very connected to this. So very much thinking about loss through the angle of suicide is kind of complicated to do, but thinking about it through the angle of grief, which already a lot of the games that I've been playing deal with, was kind of a bit simpler in a way to explain. It's also interesting to note that when you said games and loss, that's kind of what struck me. The idea primarily of bereavement and of losing somebody.
Second supervisor question. What's your methodology?
I wouldn't dare. I was just thinking, like, the final example, Spiritfarer, comes from a very specific trend, cozy games. How would you connect cozy games and grief to that then?
Well, yes, you are right. It's very much a cozy game, and I think the role of cozy games is to offer a sort of non-challenging experience to the player, to offer something that you can kind of get lost in without having too much of a trouble or friction. And in that sense, having a cozy game be about death and about grief, which is something that one would not normally associate with a cozy game, it's kind of made in a way so that you can enable the player to process through that in a way that isn't uncomfortable for them. I would say.
Great. All right. And that is all of our time for today. So let's give another big round of applause for Julian and also Diego and Mikko. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Yeah, that's it. A couple of things for the Games' Art Center that are coming up. This Sunday, we have a LARP run by Anastasia, Ukrainian LARP designer and runner, called A Rake's Progress. If you would like to sign up for that, you should talk to me immediately after this, because that's an important timeline. Also, next week, we have our own art LARP about loss called Losing Jesus. So if you would like to experience, yes, indeed, on Good Friday. So it's a good time for it. A group of people who have a very, serious religious background and community, losing a very, very key member of their community who is Jesus, because of sins and their own sins and also their sins. Please also feel welcome to talk to me. Thank you so much for coming today. And that will be that. And if maybe we get drinks afterwards, but not our digital people. So sorry, digital people, but a digital drink to both of you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
And
guys.
thank you to Antonio and to Daniel to running the tech. Yes, thank you so much. Right.